One question that we asked ourselves at the beginning and are sort of continually asking ourselves is why not a website? And this is not, and that's what I'm going to start by talking about tonight. And that's not because we're sort of tempted to make a website, but rather because we're trying to put some kind of definition around this medium, trying to figure out what an ePub should be in order to take advantage of the properties that are kind of most inherent to it. One of the first stories that Albert and Jesse told us was about this sort of very challenging process of accessioning all of the objects for the Archaeology of Digital project. One of the stories involved opening up this old computer and literally having spiders come out of it. And there are sort of many other anecdotes about trying to get these really old files and systems to run again years later. And that's not an easy thing to do at all. And I think that CCA has had some really amazing success in accomplishing that. So in a sense, this is what we want to avoid with our project. We want the project to be accessible, to use Albert's word, both presently and in the future. And I think that's partly what it means to be a publication, actually. This is how the web works. When you click a link or type a URL into your web browser, a request is made, and behind the scenes that request is actually in English, more or less, and that request is sent to a web server, which somewhere in the world, which processes it and makes a response, also more or less in English, okay, and sends that response back to your browser. So there's a transaction that takes place, and that transaction takes a little bit of time. It takes a few milliseconds. And in the end, you get a document or whatever. And of course, this happens millions of times every second, and so the mass of those requests becomes enormous across the entirety of the internet. And you might contrast that to something like a card catalog, which is sort of how we traditionally think about publications being stored and archived. That's the former card catalog at Yale, now actually gone. This is a data center at Google, and it looks a little bit like a card catalog, actually. But it's, in a way, quite different. And I think not a coincidence that this diagram has the web server returning not a static document, but the weather. So the web server is doing some thinking. And all of these massive data centers, in a way, are there to support a vast scale of momentary transactions, the transmission of content that is changing from minute to minute. They're not really there for the storage or the transmission of permanent artifacts. That's another data center in Sweden, which is actually dug into a mountain. And I think the goal of something like that is really it's security, or it's to flee subpoenas or prying eyes. The goal of a business like this is not actually permanence per se. In that way, the best image might be this one of Google's rumored ocean-going data center that would actually be positioned on a barge in order to be powered by sea currents. Not actually. This thing does belong to Google. It turns out not to be a data center, but it was a big mystery for a while. But that idea of content being mobile is really what it means to be the internet or to be a website. So a better model might be special collections, the kinds of boxes that CCA houses. And like a website, each box might contain a variety of media. It's typical of websites that it's not just one request to one server that produces a website or a web page. To get a web page, you're making many requests, potentially to many different servers. each of which is serving the different assets that produce one web page. But in this case, here we have everything kind of nicely packaged in one box, and each collection probably comes with a finding aid and inventory of what it includes. So ePub is an internationally debated and accepted open standard. This is the beginning of its official definition or declaration. It's a standard that builds on and includes many other standards. Unlike many of the archaeology of digital artifacts, ePubs will be easily decoded well into the future, even if they're no longer popular. They're based on enough other standards that it will be easy to read them. Like a special collections box, an ePub is really just a collection of files. That is the collection of files for the latest ePub that is about to go live. Unlike a website, all those files have to be contained in a single directory in one place. They can't be distributed across multiple different servers. They can't change independently of one another from time to time, like the weather might change. An ePub even has a finding aid. This is the content.opf manifest in our ePub, which lists all the files that are included in that publication. And that's necessary to be a correct ePub. And then that whole thing gets packaged up into one file, also called archiving it, and that's how it's distributed, this single file. Once you have it, you have it. As a consumer, you don't need an open network connection to use it. You aren't dependent on any other server or other system besides your own reader hardware, which might be a phone or a tablet or a Kindle. So rather than think about the kind of dynamic transactions that take place between a web browser and a web server, we thought about a different kind of dynamic, which is all of the different ways that people read. And you know this, I think, from your own experience. Bear is kind of folding his paper in half and taking some notes. People, you constantly sort of fold a magazine your way, you read it from right to left, or you you flip the dust jacket of your book to hold this place. You hold a book close to your face or far from your face, or on a table. So reading is an intimate experience that has to do with your own body and the way that you use a book or a magazine, and which is idiosyncratic from person to person, depending on your preference, your habits, also depending on things like your eyesight. In that way, reading on a phone or a tablet makes a lot more sense already than reading on something like a laptop or a desktop computer. First of all, because you can hold it in different ways. So I'm going to show you now just a few screenshots of the 3 Archaeology of the digital publications that we've released so far. And I'm just going to kind of flick through them, but I'll talk a little bit about how they are sort of configured in different ways from time to time, or they're used in different ways. This first set of slides are screenshots from an iPhone. And this is kind of you can use the book in scroll mode, where you kind of flick with your finger to get more content rather than turn pages. And that's what you see here. If you turn the phone horizontally, the typography rearranges itself. This is called a reflowable ePub. So the line length gets longer if that's your preference, just by turning it. And the hard part the challenging technical part for us has been to both make a design or typography which is beautiful and specific, but also which rearranges itself depending on how the device is used. That is something that is familiar to web designers already, though. Here it is in page mode, where you do kind of turn one page at a time, and so the book works that way too, if that's your preference. And that's just a setting in the reader. Here it is in night mode. If your preference is to read white text on a black background, you can do that too, and all the colors kind of invert themselves. In the latest publication on Frank Gehry, which I think will go live in a couple of weeks probably, maybe a week, there's actually a 3D model that you can interact with your fingers, 2 of them, which we think is a first in this kind of ePub. Here you see changing the font size, so if it's easier to read for you at a bigger font size, if that's more comfortable, you can make that setting in your reader and then you get less words per line, but bigger letters. All of these ePubs feature slideshows, which we also think is a first in this kind of reflowable ePub. It's a kind of a basic thing on websites, but e-readers are sort of like where web browsers were in 1993 or something, so we're having our own sort of archaeology of the digital moment in a way in terms of getting these things to sort of do everything that the standards promise. Of course, you can zoom in on images and blow them up. These are some screenshots on iPad. So this is an iPad being held vertically, and so you can see that, especially on the bottom, that you do get a more print-like arrangement of text with more words per line, but we're able to embed video. Chuck Hoberman expanding a Hoberman sphere in his own apartment, which is quite nice to watch. If the iPad is turned horizontally, you get a different kind of layout. Slideshows in Hoberman. If the iPad is turned horizontally but is in page mode, you get this 2-up layout, which can be nice. These ePubs are liberally sprinkled with glossary definitions, so you can get a kind of a sort of a nonlinear content by clicking on words and finding out more about them. I think we'll be taking advantage of that kind of hyperlink more in the publications to come. So this is a kind of a time-based process on its own. This is a project that started a couple of months ago, and as I said, we'll be going for the next year and a half. And so we've been developing this series of covers to look as a set nicely on your shelf and to be legible at small size, which is really the only way that you ever see the cover of an ePub is as this kind of tiny thumbnail. And these covers have begun as this sort of set of kind of metaphorical objects that maybe have a little bit of a surprising relationship to the content inside, but also act as a metaphor for that content in ways that maybe become clear as you read it. But how we think about these covers, I think, is going to evolve as the series goes on. And so we've tried to sort of set up a system that can lead to some kind of places that are as yet unpredicted by us. The palette of each publication is different from one another, so they all have kind of the same typographic layout, but the color scheme changes. In general, yeah, but the color scheme changes. And that's also something that we're sort of letting ourselves invent newly each issue. Another detail that we're changing each issue is the way that slideshow arrows work. I don't think we're going to use most of the rest of these, but we had some fun just kind of sketching into the future a little bit. But I think it's also nice to invent them as we go along. This is sort of how far we've launched so far. So even though in a way the ePub by definition is this kind of static thing, it's this package that we release once and then it doesn't change, unlike a website. Because this process itself has a kind of a timeline, we're able to think about change and dynamism in that way as a design process. And that's something that has always been an important part of our studio's approach, actually, is to think about design always as something that's in motion, that's in flux in one way or another. The last thing I'll talk about is the sort of production process, just a little bit to give you a sense of that if you're interested. This is another kind of network or dynamic that's at play in this process, even though ePub is sort of the opposite of a network. We have been developing this kind of translation software or tool chain. So we start with a manuscript, basically, plain text, which is the content of the ePub. And we sort of invented this language to describe the features that are specific to our ePubs. So for example, our ePubs have slideshows, and so we've invented a little markup language to describe slideshows. And as we add new features to these ePubs from month to month going forward, we'll be sort of adding on to that kind of internal language of ours. We then use this at the sort of heart of our tool chain or workflow is this really amazing open source software called Pandoc, which is able to translate from many, many languages or protocols into many, many other languages or protocols. So here's ePubs up there, and Markdown, which is the sort of basis of our manuscript language, is down there. And so one of the translations Pandoc can do is to go from our Markdown language to ePub. And so we've been sort of building around that, helping a little bit in a way with the development of Pandoc itself by kind of submitting feature requests when we run into things that it can't do. So this project has this kind of side effect in a way of contributing a bit to the development of this much broader project. And finally, at the other end of that process is this ePub, which is available in the iTunes Store and in other ways. It's so the first two of them are available now. This third one should be available like any day or any minute, and we'll go from there on into the future.
You can obviously double-click and zoom in. No, you didn't even say double-click. So you can obviously zoom in. But how obvious is that? I mean, I've received some complaints about this, that it's not so obvious. So I wonder, to what extent should we be providing more instructions? Because yes, we will be more and more, we will develop the habit more and more, and maybe it's not a question for many people in this audience, in this room. But for other people that will want to buy this, it is a problem because they don't have it yet. Maybe this will be the first book.
Well, I think we probably should provide a little bit more instruction, or it can't hurt. One of the, to kind of back up a little bit more, one of the kind of blessings and curses of this project is that this runs within iBooks, within an e-reader that you might be using for other books as well. So it's unlike, let's say, an iPhone app in that in general, the interface for using this book is the one that comes with your phone. You know, in terms of the way you turn pages or the way that you enlarge photos, that's not really us. That's sort of built-in. That's built-in behavior of the phone itself, of the reader software itself. So it could be the case that someone who is used to reading other books on their phone would be familiar with doing something like enlarging an image. However, there are probably lots of users that are going to use iBooks for the first time for this project, and also, yeah, we don't know how many people have been using their readers all along and never knew that they could enlarge images. So it doesn't hurt to add a little bit of instruction. For us, there's a sort of a distinction between the built-in behaviors, which include enlarging an image, and then the behaviors that we're adding. And so, for example, using a slideshow or using a 3D model is not built-in behavior to the reader. That's stuff that we're writing custom, basically. With those kinds of things, we definitely need to be extra sure that it's clear how to use them, because that's novel to our particular publication. So we definitely cannot expect that a reader inherently knows how to do it. So I think for manipulating that 3D model, for example, I really definitely do want to add more instructions.
I think maybe one also to just kind of background this historically, because I think it's an interesting parallel. About 500-600 years ago, in 1450, roughly when the printing press was invented, this generated, people usually had one book. It was the Bible. It was maybe bound, but it wasn't industrially printed. So this generated a whole new way of reading for people. All of a sudden, common people could have many books, and then you also generate, when you have so many books, all of a sudden, you think, how can I possibly read all of these books? And so it generates new forms of reading at a glance, or reading, picking up a book and putting it down. And I think, and that kind of interaction, books are actually, incredibly interactive and engaging. And that, similar to today, is kind of something that culturally will be learned, this kind of interaction with the screen and tapping, because it's not, while some people are grew up with technology more than others, it's not innate, knowing anyone, and we often take for granted that the act of turning a page is something that somebody had to invent at some point. So I think to kind of think of it this way, also that phase was called, these things were called incunabuli, and there was 50 years where they printed books that looked like scrolls. And so I think the internet is about 25 years old, so maybe we're halfway there. But I think it's important to foreground these things, thinking in this way that we're doing something new, but in a way we're also repeating history.
Yeah, I think that's the case. I mean, that's part of it. I think in a, I don't know if the iBooks reader is going to have a shorter lifespan than books, but and it does have, double tapping to enlarge an image. I think that's sort of a culturally learned behavior. It's probably going to be a flash in the pan, but it's also the case that you are using this same software application to read multiple books, even in the present moment, and so that's something that I think is analogous to incunabuli, but also a little bit different in the sense that there is literally this one frame that is holding all of the content. Yeah, it sort of recapitulates history through software code, actually.
The CCA is a collecting institution, so we are having a discussion on how to archive these publications and also how to make them accessible in our reading room. So what sort of, how should we deal with these files? How can we ensure that they will be accessible in the future, etc. And our choice of ePub, so the decision we made to produce, to use ePub file, an ePub format, was to make it as universal, as accessible as possible, because ePub seems to be the electronic format that is becoming more standard. But what is your feeling about the longevity, the life of these? I mean, now we kind of assume that a PDF you will always be able to open a PDF. Do you feel the ePub is comparable?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ePub even has some things going for it that the PDF doesn't. It's not only is it an open standard, which isn't exactly the case with PDF. In other words, the standard is well defined by kind of international bodies. That standard is also based on lots of other standards, which are also really well defined and ubiquitous. So my take is that in the distant future, what's going to change is iBooks, whatever the reader software that is used to open these files. And our slideshows may not work in practice on the reader of 25 years from now, because the readers are idiosyncratic. So in the same way that that websites sometimes break on new browsers. That can happen as well, because the content is interactive. But the file will still be readable and interpretable. The file itself is basically written in English. So you'll definitely be able to get the content and the images out of it in the future. You'll be able to probably read it on some kind of reader, even if some of the interactions work differently. But to actually get literally the same screenshots that I'm showing you here, I'm not so sure that you will. And in fact, I showed you a bunch of different screenshots, right? There isn't just one way to read this reader. It actually looks different, horizontal and vertical, and so on. And so in that sense, it's different than print, or it's different than an architectural model. So I think the answer about archiving is a funny one, and it's both, yes, this is a really permanent, open format and a great choice, but also if the thing you're trying to archive is the sort of pixel for pixel experience of it, probably no. And I think one thing that CCA, I'm sure, is finding with the Archaeology of the Digital project itself is that that's really hard to do. We were just talking about how you can open these Maya 3D models from 10 years ago. In the current version of Maya, they do still open, but they don't look exactly the same as they did 10 years ago, because the current version of Maya renders things in a more sophisticated or modern way. And that will probably be the case with these ePubs as well. So as far as in the reading room, one way to do it is to put them on an iPad from 2014 and keep that iPad working. Yeah.
Archaeology.
Yeah. But then when that iPad breaks, I do think that the file will be recoverable.
Will you keep the files of whatever you're putting there in the archives of the CCA?
Yes.
Paper files, just in case somebody remembers how to read in 50 years?
Oh, not in paper. We're keeping them as digital files. So
Okay, you will not keep the boxes with all the original papers, ministerial or whatever. Is that what you're saying?
there's a more complex, there's a publishing program linked to Archaeology of the Digital that includes also paper publications. So in that sense, the material that we use to produce those paper publications is kept, it's archived. The files that go in there, so basically the ePub is a folder of all those files, and this is also archived. So we have a procedure now that these files become part of our, let's say, digital archive, which we are developing with the Archaeology of the Digital project. So also the projects that you will see exhibited, that you saw last year, that you will see this year, they also are becoming part of the CCA collection. So those files that you see on the walls become part of the digital archive of the CCA.
But you will keep the paper files. In other words, whatever material you use to produce the digital files, you will keep it like a book from the 17th century or something.
If this source was a paper,
Yes.
yes. If the source was a digital, then it's like a digital.
And actually, yeah, the digital files themselves that we're receiving.
It's just a new format.
Yeah, exactly.
Because today, the texts we receive are digital files.
Right.
If we produce a video, it's a digital video.
And that's one of the also sort of very basic but very important features of these ePubs is that you can't publish a video and book, obviously. And so this, we can publish many new formats that you can see in the exhibition, but in the catalog, you just can't see because reasons. But yeah.
There are also images of paper, images of blueprints that are photographed or scanned, and of course the CCA is keeping the originals of those and not not showing them upon publication of the ePub.
No, because you mentioned that the catalog at Yale was a pack in the past.
Yeah, that catalog, the catalog is gone, the books are not. The catalog is now digital.
I have a question for you guys that I've never sort of asked yet, but I've always kind of thought there's a nice parallel between specifically the Eisen project in the first exhibition, which was a kind of conceptual proto-parametric approach of thinking of iterating something with variables so that it could fit to different formats. And in a way, one way I've seen these ePubs is kind of like a parametric graphic design approach. So rather than saying this image is this big on this size paper and the text is going to be like this always, you are designing based on rules. So you say that within this format on this device, it will be like this. Within this format on this device, it will automatically, and I don't know to what extent do you feel that same way, or in what ways is it different? I mean, and also different than a website, because also that happens on websites.
I think it's similar to websites, and technically it's the same technology as is used to do that on a website. There's literally a place in the code where you say when the screen is between this big and this big, then the font should be this with this amount of line spacing and any other changes you want to make to the design. So it's not parametric, I guess, in the sense of like there's not a curve that's being described there, but it's a series of conditionals, definitely. And we do see those kinds of decision trees in a few of the archaeology of the digital projects. Yeah, I don't know, do you want to talk a little bit about sort of openness in design or in our design, or think about flexible systems?
Well, one reason why we were very excited about working on this project was the kind of open-ended nature of it. We know that we will be working on it for 2 years, but we are so far only familiar with 1/5 of its content. So for us as a studio, we often get excited about designing a system that will then over time be able to change and shift in order to accommodate for any kind of new content or new approach. So in the beginning we were talking about, as you saw, that catalog of mini arrows, right? We got excited and started already sketching up on them. But one more interesting example might be the nature of these covers. In the beginning we were thinking about approaching all the covers as images of objects that will start as very simple line drawing and then over time become more and more complex, maybe working as representations of different rendering methods, etc., etc. But actually already now at issue number 4 or 5, it seems like that we will have to abandon such a strict approach and we'll start including photographs and maybe even collages or etc., etc. So we're really being open and listening to the content and kind of design is shifting depending on what we're working with. So in that sense, it's nice for us because we don't really know what it will look like by the end. Yeah.
And also, in 2 years' time, 1.5 years, there will be new technology that we don't even know what Apple and Google and every other company is playing.
Right, I think that's definitely a dimension of it too. So I think, it's similar to Eisen in that kind of, let's say, permutations are part of the design. But in another way, I think, and that is something that we've always been really interested in as a studio. But I think, Tamara gets at a really good point, which is that for us, those permutations take place over time. For example, in the case of how this design is going to evolve over 1.5 years, or they are also time-based in another sense, which is that they have to do not with a kind of a single plan, which is where you see permutations in Eisenman, but they're driven by program in a way. They're driven by the ways that users twist and turn these devices, and according to their own needs or whims. So in that sense, I think we might be more Cedric Price than Peter Eisenman or something like that. Thinking about a city or a plan that would actually change over time to accommodate different programs.
Any other questions?
You mentioned that you invented a language for the slides. Does that happen often for you to have to invent languages for projects, not only ours? Is it does it happen often?
Depending how you think about language, I think it really happens often and is a big part of our practice. So we develop a lot of websites, and one thing we pride ourselves on is making websites that our clients will be able to adapt to different needs over time. And so we often find ourselves creating a sort of a kit of parts or a set of building blocks for a website so that a client can say, I want a grid of images here, and then I want a video, and then I want a text or 5 columns of text. And so if you think about and we try to create a system that will let our clients kind of rearrange those blocks and create new pages without our involvement, basically, over time. So in that case, it might be sort of a visual system of rearranging blocks, but I often do think about that system as language, basically, or as a kind of a vocabulary that we're developing, and we do tend to develop that grammar or vocabulary custom for each client in order to make sure that the syntax that they need for their business processes or for the aesthetic that we've been developing with them is present. So in this case, it turned out, partly because of the nature of Pandoc, it did turn out to be convenient that literally what we defined is a written language that is in a text document. But in other cases, I think we are defining languages or vocabularies, at least metaphorically, for each client. And that is one of our strategies for making systems that can be flexible and evolve in a healthy way over time.
Might sound a bit naive, but you say that this, Albert said, ePub is a specific electronic platform. It means that there are more of this. I mean, I have no idea. I mean, I always say it's an e-book, but I know now that it's a mistake because there are many. I'd like to know a bit more about that. And then I have another question.
Well, among e-books, if you're saying it's an e-book, there are like 3 formats, 2 formats really. ePub, Kindle's format is different. That's really ebook, so you're not wrong, I think. There are other things you could do instead of an ebook. We could have made an app, or we could have made a PDF, or we could have made a website. These are all digital platforms of one kind or another.
And is the designer credited for ePub?
We are?
Oh, okay. Just to know. I mean, because, you know, it's such a new system that you think, okay, where is credit?
They also have the books have the ESPN. So.
Oh, yeah, okay, good to know. I mean, it's good to say.
What is interesting is that designer today means a different thing. But I mean, or in this case, it's design is a different thing. I mean, could you describe your office, what it's like, who works there, what type of expertise is there?
You want to go for that?
And also maybe the workflow of these applications.
Yeah, I mean, we have currently there are 5 of us, and we have designers, programmers, artists, and it's really most of the people wear different hats, also designers, programmers, and it's, I think for us, like this kind of new approach to design. I started already in graduate school, which was in the beginning of 2000. We graduated in 2001, 2002. And we started then exploring approach to design that will allow participation by the audience, which is extremely popular now, and also that will change over time. So before then, I think designers, I believe, praise themselves on making these very strong marks that wouldn't be altered, and that's how it was. They would design identity for the client, as an example, that would be then used as such. But now, this past decade, I think a successful identity is more perceived as this, as Dan mentioned earlier, a kit of parts, or as a system that really changes over time and that behaves slightly differently depending on what platform you're using it. So it maybe does one thing on the website and the other thing on the business card, and the third thing as a logo on a bag. But it's also the identity is not perceived as a static thing anymore, but it's more the whole language, and especially now with websites, the way you perceive the interaction between you as a user and the content also becomes a part of the identity of the content that you're reading. So that has been a passion of ours, to design for change, basically. We have developed a content management system that our clients use on websites, and so they build their own pages, and the design shifts over time. So it's always very interesting to us to see how they work, and then, sometimes we make a mistake in the way how we design it, and it's maybe too open, and the client doesn't know what to do with it, and they make a total mess. But even that is more exciting for us, because then we learn from that as designers and do it in a slightly different way the next time, rather than being completely in control over the final product.
I think that's a really good point. Also, sort of a question for us, but also for you guys. We've been so focused on how people will read this, but it's also maybe interesting to focus on how people will misread it, and those misreadings might actually be productive. And of course, since it's all new and it's new for everyone, that those misreadings might actually be just different, more interesting readings. I mean, ePub is fairly, straightforward, but I think there's still potential for this interesting version.
There is, and I bet that's quality of reading in general, isn't it? That's a very kind of something we're actually all probably quite comfortable with when you think about how you read a novel. For 60 years, I think we've been quite comfortable with the idea that everybody's going to understand a text differently, and I think that's to some extent no different than how you understand an interaction. That doesn't kind of absolve you of the responsibility to try to also assert some control over the narrative, or assert some control over the design in the approach that Tamara is talking about. But of course, there's going to be some push and pull between how much are we controlling and how much is out of our control.
Go ahead. Can I ask you one thing? It seems to me there is still some elements that maybe are something that as a user you need, or maybe because you are accustomed to books. Let's say we still have page numbers. It's still enough turning the page, even if you do it in this other way, it's very different. So I'm just curious, is it something that is kind of a nostalgic aspect, or if it's really something that is kind of like user-friendly, or it's like that you also as a designer feel that that's also, or it's something because it's kind of like close the design frame a page because then you feel that it's kind of closed. I don't know. I'm just curious of like at one point we will abandon even these, or.
there is definitely an aspect of nostalgia to the iBooks reader. In iOS 6, your books are framed with like a little bit of leather, and you see this kind of, it's like a beautiful hardbound book, and it's implied. In iOS 7, that leather is stripped away and it's more minimal. But there are still some hints of like a shadow in the gutter of the book, I think, and when you turn, you saw some screenshots where you see this kind of 3D animation. I mean, things like page numbers, they certainly have value. I mean, it is actually important to have some reference so that if you lose your place, you can get back to it, or if you're trying to share with somebody else. And Kindle does it in a more sort of hostile or alien way, in a sense. It kind of gives you this kind of digital number from like 1 to 1,000 or something, and this like percentage. iOS does do it in a more familiar feeling kind of print way, but even in that scroll view, you get these markers down the margin, which I quite like actually. This sort of to give you some sense of progress. I don't know. Ultimately, reading itself is like a cultural activity which is thousands of years old. So. The fact that we are reading, glyphs that sit on the baseline, that you could call that nostalgia. But there might be better ways to absorb information, but it's also just culture. That's the way we've learned to absorb information. So it's hard to really predict, I think, at that point. If we are talking about the Roman alphabet, it is pretty clear that having a certain, like 8 or 10 words per line is easier to read than having 50 words per line. That's biology at that point, but yeah.
I think it's kind of related to these questions. It's in terms of availability. So you are talking about like page number, but for example on Kindle, there is no more page number. So these ePubs are available only on iTunes. So if you had to make it available with another, how do you call it? Platform, will you have to redesign the book or entirely? Because each platform has his
well, yes and no. That's something we're still figuring out, but things like the page numbers come automatically, so that's not really a part of our design very much. But then again, we do fuss with things to kind of like the running headers, for example, come automatically, but as well. But which one says Canadian Center for Architecture and which one is the name of the person who's being interviewed? We fussed with that in the metadata to get it to be what we wanted. Undoubtedly, we would have to fuss with that again on a different platform. That's not really specified in the specification. We think that to release it for Android, we won't really have to redesign it. Okay. The Android store accepts ePubs per se. We know that there's no support for interactivity in Android's e-reader. So we're going to lose slideshows, for example, and 3D models. And so we have to figure out what we want to do about that. On the other hand, losing those features may have a beneficial side effect of producing a version of the ePub that may actually be more archival in a sense, or more cross-platform, because there are also e-readers on like every type of computer. And so once we kind of lose the advanced stuff this stuff is everything we've done is standards compliant, but right now the iBooks reader is the only one that is sophisticated enough to actually handle all of the standards. So if we jettison the more kind of bleeding edge stuff, we'll wind up with something that could be viewed in more libraries right now, for example, on different PCs and so on, as well as on Android. So we'll probably have kind of 2 versions at that point. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So redesign a little bit.
But if you want to be able to read it on Kindle Fire, for example, tablet or Kindle, then that's a whole new thing. It's not ePub.
It is a different format, but there are tools that can convert from ePub to Kindle's Mobi format. So a little bit remains to be seen how accurate that tool is going to be, but that'll probably be sort of a technical concern more than an entire per se a design concern, but I'm sure there will be some little issues that come up. It turns out, for that matter, that Android devices, even though you submit an ePub to the Android store, the reader on the device apparently does not. It gets translated to some proprietary Google format. Actually, this is actually just surmised. It's like a closely held secret what's going on there. But anyway, it's ultimately doesn't really matter. What's that?
A brave new world.
It's a very good world, yeah. But you can't really track the entire kind of movement of these files.
So basically what you're saying is that your programmation is on open software? Okay. What is the basic language? Is it C, C++, Python, Drupal, I don't know. What are you? My big question, and I think maybe somebody else, it's after you're gone, okay, in 2 years. This will be a fixed format, or it can evolve through this Pandoc or whatever, or what?
I think there are different sort of layers to that. The ePub in general is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's the same, and XML. It's the same standards as websites, same languages as basic websites. And so an archivist in the far future would be able to understand ePub that way, or understand it as an ePub. Our tools that we've been using to make it easier for us to create these ePubs, so that we don't, each of these slideshows comprises of like all of this JavaScript and intricate code. We don't want to have to like retype that every time we're putting in a slideshow. So we've created some tools to make that easier for us. Those tools per se, I see those tools as being potentially specific to this project, to this run of 25 issues. I mean, they could be adapted for other projects too, but so after we're gone, I don't know if those specific tools have a future necessarily. And there's another level, which is Pandoc, which is this philosopher's software that we've been basing our tools on. That has a longer life, I'm sure, and we're trying to help that project a little bit just as part of our project. But that tool is used for many other things besides ePubs. And that tool is written in a language called Haskell, actually, which is a very cutting-edge software language.
You said that you were dealing with things in the ePub that the websites did in the 90s or something like that. Not that it's not as hard. And I was wondering, because sometimes when I read text, I remember when I had a PC, I think it was a PC, that I put the cursor on a word, and then there was like a dictionary that went ping, and I had a bit of an explanation. And it's something that I'm wondering in a closed environment like an ePub, if there is enough space to introduce a kind of tool that would help the moment you don't know the word. Because sometimes you say, oh, I want to look at the dictionary, but then you forget. So it would be very nice if you could, I don't know, in what way you click, and just the same way that you did in some of the expressions that were probably important word. But in general, is it possible like to have this hidden tool to read the text?
It could be specifically that tool. I think the readers all have that actually already. So I think if you hold your finger down on any word in iBooks, you can get a dictionary. As you're describing, and that's a built-in feature of the operating system, basically. Prove me wrong. Could we add something that sophisticated? We'd probably come up against some limitations of the format. It could be done. It could be done.
And we've already sort of tried to print that a little bit with, as you mentioned, like these glossary words that are mainly technical or specific words that would be interesting to know, like right away, where you didn't have to Google what the definition of Fortran was. Or,
Yes.
But I mean, that also brings up another good point, which is something specific to iBooks, but also a lot of other readers. The idea of marginalia is another thing that, like, when books were invented, when you had your one copy of your Bible, you would never write in it because it was your only copy of your Bible. So once you had copies of books, you could write little notes in the margins for yourself in the future. And you can highlight text and make little comments on it. And so then when you open it up the next time, the same text will be highlighted. So this is another thing that is a sort of legacy of books that's interesting and also well evolved, and who knows what that will turn into in a year and a half or 25 years.
For Kindle, that's social actually. If you highlight something on Kindle, or you can see phrases that were highlighted by lots of people on Kindle, which is sort of a neat thing.
I'm just curious just thinking about the idea of a personal archive and how you combine your own personal archive. I think the music industry has been really good for the last 20 years to continuously change the formats of tracks homogeneity so that the whole industry would move forward with the vinyl, the whole industry would move forward to the mini disc and the CD and the cassette. And it seems to me that the publishing industry is not operating in the same way. So there's like a multiplicity of platforms onto which you can purchase. And so how do people then relate, how does your own personal archive of books and publishing materials relate in respect with this plurality of formats? And again, you're adding yet another format to the equation on top of the possibility of having something offline, possibility of having something online.
Yeah, well, it's true. ePub, talking about format, ePub seems like a decent bet for your archive. It is compatible with a lot of different readers in general. I don't know if I didn't really mention this, but CCA also has made a choice not to put copy protection on this ePub, which they could have done. So it can be moved from one computer to another, or even shared actually with your friends, technically. As for, and there are tools to convert, to get an ePub onto your Kindle. There's a separate issue in a way, which is, or two separate issues. One has to do with platform, which is a little bit of a different thing than format. So I think the platforms where you can buy ebooks have fragmented even more than the format has. Google has a different marketplace than Apple has, and that's different than Amazon. But there basically are just these two formats so far for ebooks, which is Amazon's format and the open format, which is ePub. And then there's a separate issue, which is how good are the readers, basically, and that's what I was alluding to when I was talking about web browsers in the 90s. The ePub format is standard. That doesn't mean that all of the readers are able to render all of the aspects of the format. And that's where, even though our slideshows are standard compliant, they're not going to work on every reader. And that gets at a difference basically between an interactive publication as compared to a music file, which is not interactive. The MP3 standard is basically a lot simpler than the ePub standard. It just has to play the waveform. So it's a little bit apples and oranges to really dig into your question, I think. Yeah, I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I agree. It is a problem, and it's also in a way it's an interesting decision that CCA made to go with ePub, and we made to go with ePub, because the most popular marketplace or the most popular platform by far is Amazon's. So we sort of steered clear of the biggest marketplace in order to use a format that seems more durable or more open.